The war between the planet's inhabitants had raged for decades, and the battlefield stretched across the galaxy like endless scars in the stars. Lyra, the alien princess of the Valdar race, was no stranger to conflict. Trained from a young age as both a leader and a warrior, she had fought on the front lines of this war for years. The fate of her people and their home planet rested heavily on her shoulders. Today, Lyra stood on a crimson-lit battlefield, her heart pounding in her chest. She was an elite soldier of her people, her armor a gleaming blend of advanced technology and royal insignia. Her sleek, silver battle suit hugged her lithe form, designed to enhance her speed and agility. As the chaos of war swirled around her, Lyra was calm, focused. Her gaze was sharp, her senses alert, honed by years of training. The enemy forces were close, and they had to be stopped before they reached the capital. The Valdar had been at war with the Xerian Dominion for decades, a vicious struggle fueled by ideological differences and territorial disputes. Lyra had witnessed the destruction of entire cities, the loss of friends, the pain of her people. But she had never faltered in her resolve to protect her home. Her father, the king, had often spoken of duty and sacrifice. And Lyra understood those lessons well. Sacrifice was a constant companion in this war. As she led her troops through the battlefield, her thoughts wandered to something else, someone else. A distant memory, one from her childhood, when the war had not yet touched their lives. It was of a boy named Darian, her best friend before the fighting began. They had spent countless hours together, playing in the gardens of the palace, dreaming of a future without war. But that was before the Xerian forces attacked, before the war had torn them apart. Darian had vanished in the chaos of that first attack, and Lyra hadn't seen him since. The thought of him haunted her in quiet moments, but she pushed it aside. The war demanded all her attention. There was no room for nostalgia. She raised her arm, signaling to her command, and her soldiers fell into formation. The battlefield ahead was a blur of blasters, explosions, and the sounds of distant cries. The enemy was drawing closer, and Lyra's mind sharpened. She had a mission to complete. Her troops advanced, moving with precision, as Lyra led them toward the heart of the enemy's encampment. The tension in the air was thick, every step carrying the weight of what was to come. Her battle instincts kicked in, and she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was what she had been born to do: fight, lead, and protect. And then it happened. A figure appeared on the horizon, cutting through the smoke and flames with eerie precision. He moved like a phantom, his form cloaked in dark armor. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as he approached. His presence was unlike anything she had ever felt before, powerful, commanding, and familiar. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, it reminded her of someone from her past. The figure closed the distance between them, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity, met hers through the visor of his helmet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around her faded as she stared into those eyes, recognizing something deep within them. Darian. The boy she had known as a child was standing before her, but he was no longer the same. He was different, changed. And as the realization hit her, a wave of emotion surged through her. She wanted to reach out, to shout his name, but the war was far from over. Duty was everything now, and there was no room for distractions. But as she stared at him, she couldn't help but wonder, how had he become this powerful soldier? What had happened to him all these years? And most importantly, why was he fighting against her now? Before she could process her thoughts further, the sound of blasters filled the air. The battle raged on, and Lyra was forced to act. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the shock and confusion that threatened to overtake her. "Move forward," she ordered her troops, her voice steady, even as her heart raced. She couldn't allow herself to falter, not now. But even as she charged into the fray, Lyra couldn't shake the image of Darian's eyes, still burning with an intensity that mirrored her own. What had happened to him? And why had fate brought them together on this battlefield? The answers would have to wait. For now, the battle demanded her full attention. But deep down, Lyra knew that this war was about to take a very different turn. And as the dust of the battlefield swirled around her, she couldn't help but wonder if Darian's appearance was more than just coincidence. If fate had truly brought them together, it would be for a reason. The questions would come later. The battle would continue. And in the chaos of war, Lyra couldn't help but think that the real battle was only just beginning. The battle raged on around Lyra, yet her mind remained locked in a whirlwind of thoughts. She had recognized Darian. She knew it was him. His face, hidden behind the mask of an enemy soldier, had carried the same familiar features from years ago. His presence had been unmistakable. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes, the way his posture held an eerie mix of strength and familiarity. Yet, the soldier before her was far different from the boy she had once known. The Valdar people had been at war for so long that Lyra had nearly forgotten what peace felt like. She had been raised in the harshness of it all, prepared to lead, to fight, to sacrifice. But seeing Darian on the opposite side of the battlefield shattered the certainty she had in her own resolve. He was not the innocent child she remembered. The Darian she had known was gone, replaced by a stranger with the same face but a different heart. As Lyra fought on, her thoughts drifted back to their childhood. They had been inseparable back then, before the war consumed everything. They had spent endless days together, running through the palace gardens, playing in the sun, and talking about dreams that no longer seemed possible. They had been two souls bound by the same hope for a peaceful future. But that was a lifetime ago. The war had torn them apart, and Lyra hadn't heard a word from him since that fateful day. She had assumed he was lost, or worse, dead. The thought had haunted her for years. Now, here he was, standing on the battlefield, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The man before her was a warrior, an elite soldier of unknown origin, and a part of the enemy force. His allegiance was clear. Yet, Lyra's heart ached with confusion and disbelief. Was it truly him? How had he survived? And why was he fighting against her people? Lyra's mind spun, but her body remained focused on the task at hand. The fight wasn't over. She had a duty to fulfill, and the fate of her people hung in the balance. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Yet, as the battle waged around her, she couldn't ignore the pull of the past, the unanswered questions that lingered in the depths of her heart. The battle intensified, and the once clear lines of the battlefield began to blur. The enemy forces, despite their strength, were faltering, and Lyra's troops pressed forward with relentless determination. But even as victory seemed imminent, Lyra couldn't shake the image of Darian from her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden command from her lieutenant, Azar, who pulled her back into the present. "Your Highness, we need to push forward. The enemy is retreating." Lyra nodded, her voice cold but firm. "Move in. Don't let them regroup." As she led her soldiers forward, her eyes darted to the distant figure of Darian. He was still there, still fighting, but something about the way he moved, the way he fought, told her that he was holding back. He wasn't fighting to kill. He wasn't fighting to win. No, Darian wasn't just a soldier. He was something else, something Lyra couldn't yet understand. The battle seemed to stretch on for hours, the chaos and destruction relentless. And through it all, Lyra couldn't stop thinking about Darian. What had happened to him? Why was he here? Why had he become a soldier in the first place? After what seemed like an eternity, the battle finally came to a halt. The enemy forces had retreated, but Lyra's heart remained heavy. She had won the day, but it felt like a hollow victory. Her mind kept returning to Darian. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Lyra found herself moving through the battlefield, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She had to find him, had to confront him. The need for answers burned within her, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished until she understood what had happened to him. Her soldiers were finishing their tasks, and the sounds of the battlefield began to fade into the background. The quiet was deafening. Lyra moved through the wreckage, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of Darien. It wasn't long before she found him. He was standing alone, his back to her, his posture rigid and unmoving. He had removed his helmet, revealing his face, the same face she remembered from so many years ago. His features were hardened now, more chiseled, but beneath the layers of time and experience, it was still him. Darien, Lyra's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. But it was enough. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with hers. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced with something colder, something guarded. "Lyra," he said, his voice rough and distant. "I didn't expect to see you again." She took a step forward, her heart pounding. "I didn't expect to see you either. What happened to you? Where have you been all these years?" Darien's eyes darkened, and he took a deep breath. "I've been surviving. I joined the military after the war took everything from me. It was the only way to make a difference. The only way to survive." Lyra's heart tightened. "But why fight for the enemy? Why fight against us? Why against me?" Darien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "I didn't have a choice, Lyra," he said finally. "When the war started, when they took me, no one cared who I was. I became a soldier, a weapon. The war changed me. It changed everything." Lyra swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. The Darien she had known was gone. The boy who had laughed and played in the gardens with her had been replaced by someone who had seen too much pain, too much death. "But I haven't forgotten you," he added, his voice softening for a moment. "I could never forget you." Tears welled in Lyra's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "Then why didn't you come back? Why didn't you?" "I couldn't," he interrupted. "I couldn't come back. Not when everything I knew had been destroyed. Not when I was no longer the person you knew." The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words, of years lost, of love unacknowledged. Finally, Lyra took another step toward him, her hand reaching out, trembling. "Darien, we have to stop this. We have to stop fighting." Darien met her gaze, and for a moment, there was a flicker of the boy she had once known, before the war, before everything had changed. "I know," he whispered. "But I don't know how." The tension between Lyra and Darien hung in the air like a thick fog, both of them standing frozen in place. Neither of them knew what to say next, and the weight of years spent apart, of painful memories buried deep, pressed down on their shoulders. For a brief moment, Lyra considered stepping back, leaving Darien to his fate, but her heart refused to let go. It had been so long since she had seen him, yet nothing about this moment felt right. How could things have changed so completely? How had the carefree boy she had once known become this soldier standing before her? She wanted to know everything, the how, the why, the reasons for his silence. Darien lowered his gaze, as though ashamed to meet her eyes, and it was that simple action that spoke volumes to Lyra. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, unsure of what her next move should be. She had to get answers, had to understand why he had become part of the enemy's forces. But no matter how hard she tried to think logically, all that consumed her was the memory of their childhood bond. "I didn't choose this life, Lyra," Darien finally spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "When the war took everything from me, my family, my home, there was no room for a choice anymore. They trained me, shaped me into a weapon. I couldn't stop it." Lyra clenched her fists at her sides, trying to hold back the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to hate him for what he had become, for the side he had chosen, for the pain he had caused. But instead, she found herself remembering the boy who had always been there for her, the one who had held her hand as they made promises of a future together. She was no longer sure where the line between soldier and friend began or ended. "Then why come back now?" she asked softly. "Why fight your own people, Darien?" He hesitated before answering, looking up at the sky as though searching for an answer in the clouds above. "Because I see something in you, Lyra. I see the person I once knew. And maybe, just maybe, I'm still that person inside. But the war, it changes everything. It changes you." Lyra couldn't find the words to respond. Her mind was spinning, her heart in turmoil. The man standing before her was so different from the boy she had shared her childhood with, and yet, in the way he looked at her, she could still see the traces of the person he used to be. "I never wanted to hurt you," Darien continued, his voice cracking. "I never wanted to fight against you. But I had no choice." Lyra closed her eyes, allowing the stillness to settle around them. She couldn't fully comprehend what had happened to Darien, but she knew that somewhere in the depths of her heart, she couldn't give up on him. The bond they once shared was too strong, too deep to be broken by time and distance alone. She took a deep breath and made a decision. There had to be a way to end this cycle of violence, to stop the war that had torn their worlds apart. But it would require both of them to make difficult choices, to fight for something greater than themselves. "Then let's stop this," Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We have to stop this war. We have to stop killing each other." Darien looked at her, his expression softening as he stepped closer. "And how do you propose we do that?" "I can't just walk away from everything I've done, Lyra. I've killed, taken lives, more than I care to count. How can I undo all of that?" Lyra reached out and placed her hand on his arm, the touch gentle yet firm. "We start by being who we used to be. By remembering the people we once were. The war has stolen our future, but we still have the power to choose a different path. I know you're not lost, Darien." He closed his eyes for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. "And what if it's too late? What if we can't undo the damage we've caused?" "We fight," Lyra said simply. "We fight for the chance to start over. We fight for the chance to rebuild, to find a way to heal." For the first time since they had reconnected, Darien seemed to see a glimmer of hope. He looked at her, his gaze filled with uncertainty but also something else, something Lyra hadn't seen in a long time. A spark of the man he used to be. "I'll help you," he whispered, his voice raw. "But it won't be easy. There are too many forces at play. Too many enemies who won't stop until they've destroyed everything we care about." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening around his arm. "Then we'll fight together. We'll find a way to win, to end this." The wind blew through the battlefield, carrying with it the scent of the distant trees. Lyra could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead would not be easy. They would have to fight harder than they ever had before, not only against the enemies that threatened their lives but also against the forces that sought to keep them apart. But Lyra knew that with Darien by her side, they could change the course of their fate. As the two of them stood together, facing the uncertain future, they shared a moment of silent understanding. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but it was a road they would walk together. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra believed that there was still a chance for peace, a chance for the future they had once dreamed of. The war was far from over, but it was no longer the only thing that defined them. Now, they had a reason to fight, not just for victory, but for each other. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. Lyra and Darien, now fully reunited in their shared mission, worked tirelessly to form a plan that could potentially end the war between their people. But the road to peace was never simple, especially when enemies lurked around every corner. The battlefield outside was only one layer of the war they had to contend with. Within their ranks, distrust simmered. Soldiers loyal to Darian's old commanders still saw him as a traitor, a liability, and a potential target. Meanwhile, Lyra's own people, her fellow warriors, were not as open to the idea of making alliances with someone who had once been their enemy. No matter how much they tried to hold their heads high, the truth was undeniable: unity was a fragile concept when survival was on the line. In the makeshift command center, a darkened room deep within their military base, the walls were covered in tactical maps and communication screens flashing reports from various fronts of the war. Lyra paced the room, her mind racing with potential moves, counterattacks, and alliances. She couldn't afford to make mistakes, too many lives were at stake. Darian was seated at a table, reviewing battle intel. His dark eyes flicked between the data on the screen and the room's occupants, but his focus was nowhere near the numbers. His mind was on Lyra, on the quiet strength she exhibited and how much he admired it. He had never imagined that this person, this woman who had once shared his dreams, would become such a powerful leader. But she had, and in doing so, she had become his anchor. Darian, Lyra called out from the other side of the room, breaking his train of thought. I've been thinking. The peace talks won't work. They won't listen to us. They'll only see our people's weakness, not the strength we have when we stand united. Darian's gaze softened as he met her eyes. He understood what she was saying, it was the bitter truth. Peace was a luxury their people couldn't afford right now. They needed to show their enemies that they were capable of something more. That they had power, resilience, and the courage to go the distance. We'll need something bigger, he replied quietly, then stood up, walking toward her. Something that will shake them. Lyra's brows furrowed, but she didn't speak immediately. She could sense the weight of his words, his intent. She had seen him fight with unmatched ferocity in the past few days, but this was different. This was a whole new kind of determination. What are you thinking? Darian took a deep breath. We strike at the heart of their command. We show them that we can breach their defenses and that they can no longer take us for granted. We don't need to kill everyone. We just need to send a message. A powerful one. Lyra stared at him for a long moment, absorbing his words. Her instincts screamed at her to reject the idea. It was risky. Dangerous. The number of lives it would cost. But then again, what choice did they have? How many more lives would be lost if they kept retreating and waiting for an opportunity to emerge? Their people were starving, fighting on multiple fronts, and the longer the war dragged on, the less hope they had of ever rebuilding. You're right, she said, her voice steady. We'll show them what we're capable of. For the next few hours, they worked together, creating a plan that would take their forces deep into enemy territory. It wasn't about domination, it was about making a statement. A tactical strike at the heart of their enemy's power would cripple their supply chains, disrupt their command, and force them to reconsider their position in the war. As night fell, Lyra and Darian stood side by side, overlooking the vast expanse of the battlefield. It was a surreal moment, one of deep reflection. How had they gone from childhood friends to enemies on opposing sides, and now, to this? Standing together, planning their next move. I'm not the person I was back then, Darian said softly, his gaze distant. I've done things, Lyra, things that can never be undone. I don't know if I can ever be the man you once knew. Lyra's hand found his, their fingers locking together in a firm grip. We both have scars, she replied. But that doesn't define us. What defines us is what we do now, together. We can rebuild, Darian. We can make something new. The weight of her words settled over him like a cloak, heavy but warm. For the first time since they had been reunited, Darian allowed himself to believe that redemption might be possible. That he could find a way back to the person he once was, and that maybe, just maybe, they could fix the broken pieces of their lives. The plan was set in motion the following day. As Lyra and Darien led their forces toward the enemy's core, their hearts beat in unison, warriors united by purpose, driven by the hope that they could alter the course of history. The enemy had no idea what was coming. Hours passed, the tension thick in the air as they neared the enemy's stronghold. Their forces had grown strong, unified by a common cause. But there were still risks that could end in disaster. And yet, Lyra couldn't afford to think about failure. They had come too far to turn back now. In the silence before the storm, she exchanged one last glance with Darien. The unspoken words passed between them like a current, understanding, trust, and something deeper, something that had never truly left, no matter how many years had passed. The battle raged for hours, the echoes of explosions and the hum of weapons filling the air. Lyra and Darien led their troops with fierce precision, pushing forward despite the odds stacked against them. Their mission was clear: cripple the enemy's command center, cut off their supply lines, and send a message that would shake the entire war. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as they advanced through the dense, rocky terrain. The enemy's stronghold loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and energy shields designed to withstand even the most powerful assaults. But they were no longer just soldiers fighting for survival, they were warriors fighting for the future of their people, and for the hope of a better world. The ground trembled beneath them as the battle intensified. Lyra could feel the heat of the explosions from nearby blasts, but her focus remained unshaken. Every step, every movement, every decision was calculated. She trusted her people, and more importantly, she trusted Darien. Together, they had forged a bond stronger than steel, one that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. As they neared the enemy's core, the ground split open beneath them, sending a shockwave through the air. Lyra and Darien were momentarily thrown off balance, but they quickly recovered, leading their forces into the final push. The enemy was strong, but Lyra knew their resolve was even stronger. "We're almost there," Darien shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Stay focused. We have one shot at this." Lyra nodded, her mind sharp and clear. "Keep pushing forward. We don't stop until we've reached their command center." With renewed determination, they advanced through the gates of the enemy stronghold. The air was thick with smoke, and the glow of energy shields illuminated the battlefield in eerie flashes. Lyra's heart raced as they breached the outer defenses, their weapons clashing with the enemy's soldiers in a brutal showdown. Darien's voice cut through the noise, a guiding force in the storm. "Push through. We're almost there." The last line of defense was a heavily fortified door that led to the heart of the enemy's command center. Lyra and Darien moved swiftly, side by side, clearing the path for their soldiers. The door was reinforced with the strongest materials known to their enemies, but with a combination of explosives and sheer force, it fell. The command center was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen, a sprawling complex filled with advanced technology, blinking consoles, and rows of armed soldiers. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the message they were about to send. The enemy had to know that they were no longer untouchable. As the final blast rang out, Lyra and Darien entered the command center. The enemy forces inside were caught off guard, their defenses crumbling under the weight of their assault. Lyra wasted no time, her blade was in her hand, cutting through their ranks with precision. Darien fought by her side, his every movement a testament to the warrior he had become. Then, as they reached the central control room, they encountered the enemy commander, the one who had orchestrated much of the war. His face was cold and calculating, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes as he saw the two of them standing before him. You won't win," the commander sneered, trying to maintain his composure. "We are invincible." Lyra stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Your arrogance has cost countless lives. But this ends now." With a swift motion, she disabled the central control system, sending a surge of energy through the complex. The lights flickered, and the hum of the facility grew silent. The enemy's power had been cut off, their command center disabled. The war was over. The realization hit them both at once. The battle, the struggle, the pain, it had all led to this moment. They had done it. Together, they had brought an end to the war that had ravaged their worlds. But the victory came with a heavy price. Lyra turned to Darian, her gaze softening. "It's over. We've done it." Darian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of the world lifting from their shoulders. They had fought side by side, and now, they stood victorious, united by their past, their present, and their future. But the end of one battle marked the beginning of another. Lyra knew that the true work was only just beginning. Rebuilding their worlds, restoring peace, and healing the wounds of war would take time. But with Darian by her side, she felt a sense of hope she had not known for years. "We've done it," Darian whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I never thought we would come this far." Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We always had the strength within us. We just had to remember who we were, and what we stood for." As they stood together in the heart of the enemy's shattered fortress, Lyra and Darian knew that their journey was far from over. But one thing was certain, they had found a new beginning, not just for themselves, but for their people. And for the first time in years, Lyra allowed herself to believe in a future where peace and hope could flourish. A future that she and Darian would build, together.